Hello and welcome again to Tuesday's edition of Alaska Weather. Up first, we've got hazardous weather graphic. Got coastal flood warnings and high wind warnings out for the St. Lawrence Island area, Bering Strait coast, and also the northwest coast. High wind warnings for Kotzebue Sound and the Noaa Valley, and the western Arctic coast, central Arctic coast, and the western North Slope. Those are kick into effect about midnight Wednesday night and continue through Thursday night into Friday. Looking for winds to increase 30 to 40 miles an hour sustained with gusts to 65 miles an hour all through the red shaded areas there. And again, along the coast, coastal flood warnings are out to go along with the strong winds. Yellow shaded area, that's a coastal flood advisory that's out from midnight Wednesday night through Thursday night and again into Friday. And that's for the Yukon Delta coast, Norton Sound area, and then a portion of the north coast of the Seward Peninsula there. And from there, going on to satellite imagery, you can see a lot of cloudiness tracking from southeast to northwest, bringing some clouds and areas of rain, mostly into the southern Kenai Peninsula, Kodiak Island, where they had the heaviest amount there at Kodiak State Airport, and into Kamishak Bay, and then some clouds up along the lower Yukon River Valley area and up over the northwest interior there, bringing some areas of light precipitation there in the form of snow over the western Brooks Range, light snow, and then showery conditions, areas of light rain, mostly less than 1/10 of an inch there. Otherwise, variable mid and high clouds over the panhandle. Still some sunshine going on in areas there. Temperatures rising into the 60s over the southern panhandle. In fact, Sitka had 68 degrees at 3 p.m. this afternoon, and Klawock 66 degrees, with Heidelberg at about 61. So still very mild temperatures down there. And then high pressure making a break there over the Bering Sea, although still some shower activity around the Pribilofs. And then some kind of loose clouds there ahead of the next system that's over the Russian Far East. That's the one that's going to bring the strong winds into the northern Bering Sea and into the high wind warning areas that I just spoke of. Otherwise, today, a fair amount of clearing there north of the Alaska Range all the way up to the eastern Arctic coast. Seeing clear skies, light winds today. Of course, much colder up there over the Arctic coast, lows in the teens this morning, and not much warmer this afternoon. A little milder on the west side there, with more clouds, moisture, and more of a southwest wind flow to a certain extent. Otherwise, rain, moderate to heavy at times. Kodiak Island, they had over an inch at Kodiak State Airport, about 1.2 inches to be exact, and some rain along the Alaska Peninsula and gusty winds of 25 gusts 40 plus miles per hour for the eastern Aleutians into the western Alaska Peninsula, and breezy over Bristol Bay. And then you lose the winds and precipitation as you head north, and then that trough bringing the light moisture there, some scattered showers over the Yukon Delta. It gets a little more extensive as you head northwest there, but heaviest rainfall amounts I could find was Togiak, had 1/4 of an inch. Of course, that's associated with a system down there, and Kenai also picked up about 1/10 of an inch of rain today, and then Buckland had about 1/10 of an inch up there on the north side of the Seward Peninsula. And for tonight, that front begins to spread some rain into the across the southeast coast. Rainfall chances increase, especially as that front approaches the south coast. Periods of light rain for the North Gulf Coast, Kenai Peninsula, down to Kodiak Island. Should stay dry over Cook Inlet, Madanuska, Susitna Valley, Copper River Basin, as well as much of the interior. A few flurries with a weak trough crossing the eastern Arctic coast. Then the next big storm begins to really kick the winds up and the seas and rain. St. Lawrence Island with the wind warning not kicking in there until Wednesday night at midnight, but you're going to see a significant increase in the winds tomorrow afternoon as well as the Bering Strait coast. Tomorrow evening for the northwest coast, definitely tomorrow night. Still a chance of flurries over the eastern Arctic coast, chance of rain for the North Gulf Coast, and portions of the Panhandle. Nothing heavy at all, though, in any of those areas. Still kind of damp and unsettled for Kodiak Island, but high pressure ridging into the interior makes for dry conditions with light winds over much of interior Alaska. And next day, intense storm up to the north there, northeast of Wrangell Island. You can see a very tight gradient there, and so the coastal flood warnings and high wind warnings out for the northwest coast, Bering Strait coast areas to the western Arctic coast, with again gusts 65 miles per hour or more in the normally windier areas there. But that front, as it moves inland, will weaken considerably. Wind's not much of a factor with that south of the Brooks Range, but some areas of rain with it all the way down to the southwest coast. Weak trailing edge drags across the Pribilofs. Lows in the 40s to 50s there across the southeast coast tonight. That 59 at Sitka. Pretty mild for this time of year. Otherwise, lows in the 30s and 40s elsewhere. Highs tomorrow, 50s mostly, mid to upper in some locations, and mid-60s southern Panhandle, followed by lows in the 40s to mid-50s for the southeast coast, upper 30s to upper 40s for the remainder of southern Alaska. Highs approaching 70 there again for St. Lawrence or Prince of Wales Island, and 60s all the way up to Skagway, Juneau, and Haines. Otherwise, mild mid to upper 50s southern Alaska to Kodiak, lows in the 20s. Brooks Range on out to the Arctic coast, otherwise 30s, highs upper 40s to lower 50s, cooler from the Brooks Range to the Arctic coast, and lows mid-20s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
First line weather graphic, we've got IFR, Central Arctic coast down across the north slope there, western Brooks Range into the Kobuk Valley, Selawik, near Kotzebue, and then down to Buckland into the central Seward Peninsula. Another area of IFR around St. Lawrence and St. Matthew Islands. Big area of IFR there over the central western Aleutian, southwest Bering Sea. And yet another zone of IFR, Kodiak Island, eastward, across the southern Gulf of Alaska into the south coast of the Panhandle. Pretty good VFR over the interior. And for the afternoon, again, central, eastern, and actually all the way out to the southwest coast, Nunivak Island, all VFR, as well as Bristol Bay and the Aleutian Range. Cook Inlet, mostly VFR, into the Susitna Valley. Madanuska Valley picking up some marginal VFR, that moisture pushing up along the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound. IFR from, say, Portage westward to Valdez, and down to Kodiak Island again, mainly the Fognak eastern Kodiak Island, and right along the North Gulf Coast, and then a more expansive area of IFR covering the Panhandle. IFR now shifting eastward to the eastern Arctic coast, North Slope, and some hung up along the western Brooks Range. And then IFR, northern Bering Sea, expands as it heads down to the south there across the western and central Aleutians. And for Thursday morning, IFR, Kiska Island eastward to Unmak Island, northward across the Pribilofs to the Yukon Delta coast, on up there to the south coast of the Seward Peninsula, Nome to about Golovin, those areas. And IFR along the Brooks Range, VFR for the North Slope and eastern Arctic coast, IFR for the central and western Arctic coast. And again, the central interior looking pretty good there, right on down to the southwest coast, Bristol Bay. Pretty good VFR. Susitna Valley, Cook Inlet, VFR, and some IFR for the North Gulf Coast, and over areas of the Panhandle. A little bit better Kodiak Island, just mostly marginal. And then for the afternoon, VFR Shelikof Strait, but Kodiak Island, marginal VFR that extends up to about Kachemak Bay. In the southern Seward Peninsula, Resurrection Bay into Prince William Sound, Copper River Basin. Then a narrow band of IFR from the eastern Arctic coast southwestward there across the Yukon Delta, Nunivak Island, Pribilofs, marginal for the Aleutians and the Panhandle. Anatuvik and Adigan tomorrow, marginal VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill looking pretty good. VFR most of the day, as well as rainy, windy, and Isabel, all VFR. Mentasta looking good as well. Could be some lower conditions on the southern entrance. It possibly couldn't be in the marginal VFR zone, but Tanita more likely seeing some marginal VFR, especially on the eastern entrance. Portage, IFR, Chilcoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels, 10,000 feet back north there over the southeast interior, eastern Alaska range, also pushing north a fair ways over the western Bering Sea, 12,000 feet over the western central Aleutians. And moisture here as far as icing goes, mostly isolated moderate rime icing for the North Gulf Coast and Panhandle, Prince William Sound down to Kodiak Island, and the next batch with that big storm coming in, an active front into the northern Bering Sea, still mostly west of St. Lawrence Island, the Bering Strait through the day. And for the jet stream, you can see pretty strong west to southwest flow, 75 knots pushing that moisture eastward tomorrow. St. Lawrence Island, 145 knots near the Komodorskis, otherwise north-northeast, 105 knots there across the Alaska Peninsula, and then south to north flow, 80 to 100 knots coming up toward the northern southeast coast. 9,000 feet, south-southeast winds 55 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast, and then those strong westerlies there working their way in toward the central Bering Sea, strongest over the northwest Bering, southwest about 70 knots there through the Bering Strait, 3,000 feet, 70 knots just southwest of St. Lawrence Island, 50 knots there a little farther south across St. Matthew Island, and then pretty windy conditions with that low over the western Gulf of Alaska. And look for a considerable moderate chop for the North Gulf Coast and increasing moderate chop for Cape Lisburne, Point Hope, down to the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island to St. Matthew Island. Isolated moderate chop there for the Alaska Peninsula, Kenai Peninsula, eastward to about Elfin Cove. After the break, I'll be back with the marine forecasts.
I can't really name anyone that has so much integrity as she does to the things that she's accomplishing. It's pretty amazing. Having Claire as a role model, just a strong woman in science and just so smart and so kind. It's just a huge confidence booster. Is that, hey, I could do that too, you know? That's possible, that's successful, that's what I want to do.
I would characterize her as a pioneer in the field.
The amount and quality of the work she's put out is second to none.
I know people who have a lot of tenacity. I know people that have integrity, but it's rare that people have both together in that, that combination that Claire does.
Every morning, Dr. Claire Parkinson gets up before sunrise and runs 2 miles to work. She hasn't missed a day in nearly 40 years. To know the evolution of sea ice and how we observe it from space is to know Claire. This year, she's celebrating 40 years at NASA.
When I arrived at Goddard, which was in July of 1978, it was an incredibly exciting period here. Satellites were pretty new, but a lot of data had been collected.
NASA scientists were inundated with information, and Claire was in a cohort looking at sea ice, trying to make sense of a jumble of very raw, very new data. It was around that time that Claire and her team, at the time led by Dr. Jays Wally, created the principal sea ice record that we use today. How does something like that record help you do your job?
Oh, that record is fundamental to understanding sea ice. So without it, we wouldn't know how rapidly it's changing.
You may not realize it, but Claire's work studying the changing extent of the ice caps deeply affected our understanding of climate change, and relatedly, our understanding of how climate change affects life on Earth.
One of the clearest signals for climate change that resonates with people has been this shrinking of the polar ice cap in the summer that we're able to see because of Claire's work.
After we had a record that was about 15, 20 years long, we started noticing that the extent of the ice in the Arctic was getting smaller over time.
Sea ice is formed on the surface of the ocean and therefore is made from seawater. The biggest concentration is in the Arctic, and it's also where the biggest loss in sea ice is occurring. Every year, NASA reports on the sea ice minimum and maximum extents. As expected, the data is concerning.
By now, not only has this trend toward lesser ice continued, but it's even accelerated, so that now the decreases are greater than what they had been.
These trends are deeply troubling, but one thing's for sure. Our awareness of shrinking sea ice extent due to climate change was propelled faster and further after Claire Parkinson arrived at NASA.
I mean, she takes her job seriously, and the health and welfare of those instruments in space, yeah, she's on it. You know, it's one of the things you don't worry about because Claire's in the loop on these things. It's going to be fine.
In science, we stand on the shoulders of giants, on the shoulders of those who explored before us. But then, some among us are giants.
For a scientist, it's incredibly exciting to be studying these glaciers and ice sheets right now because they're doing something that hasn't happened in thousands of years. We're watching changes take place that haven't happened since the end of the last ice age. Tuesday was cold, I almost froze my toes. Oh, what's it gonna be next week? Who knows? That's climate. Oh, that's the climate you got. You take a bunch of weather and you average it together and you're doing the climate rock.
At a glacial pace, it means something's happening so slowly you can barely tell it's happening at all. That used to describe the very incremental movement glaciers and ice sheets experienced each year. But now that's changing. We're tagging along with 3 NASA scientists to understand the different lengths they go to not only investigate ice sheets and glaciers, but also communicate their often complicated science to the public. First, let's get oriented. Ice sheets, in pink, pretty much occur in only 2 places, Antarctica and Greenland. Glaciers, in yellow, play a key role draining melt off the ice sheet. Glaciers are also found in the high mountains, but we'll get to those in another episode.
So we know that something's happening in Greenland right now that's unprecedented in the last several thousand years.
That's Dr. Josh Willis, oceanographer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Josh and his team are tackling one of the major environmental challenges of the 21st century, trying to answer fundamental questions about how melting glaciers impact sea level rise.
With my mission, Oceans Melting Greenland, or OMG for short, we're trying to understand just how much of Greenland's melt is caused by the oceans.
Along with being one of NASA's top scientists working on the cryosphere, Josh is passionate about demystifying climate change in typically unconventional ways.
I think by reaching out to people with a little bit of humor, a little bit of fun, maybe a song, you really have the opportunity to help people understand and come to terms with what we're doing to our planet. Because it's definitely happening and it's definitely a big deal, and we need to start preparing for it.
Down at the opposite pole, Dr. Kelly Brunt is getting ready for a major expedition.
In December and January this coming year, I'll actually be in Antarctica down near the South Pole collecting ground-based GPS data.
This is actually Kelly's second expedition to the South Pole. The first occurred in December and January of last year. Both surveys are critical and will help validate data collected by NASA's airborne campaign, Operation Icebridge, and the recently launched satellite mission ISAT-2.
All three of these layers, that ground-based, that airborne, and the satellite, are all tied together. The ground-based helps validate both the satellite and the airborne helps give us more validation data for the satellites, but also a bigger story with respect to the depth of the ice sheet and what's going on underneath the surface.
While some scientists are taking measurements in the field, others are looking for answers in physics and lines of code.
For me, those projections that we are doing, they do have a very personal meaning.
Dr. Sophie Nowicki is an ice sheet modeler. That means she and her team have the important job of forecasting how ice will change in the future, which also predicts changes in sea level rise. It's a job she doesn't take lightly, especially since urban planning and infrastructure use her team's models to make decisions about the future and safety of their communities.
When we make those projections that are 100 years in the future, 100 years can seem so far away, like I don't have to worry about it, it's just too far. But actually they are not. It's really like the future that we are looking at that our children or grandchildren will see to experience.
Whether it's learning to communicate in new ways, traversing a swath of Antarctica in a massive piston bully, or taking responsibility for an impactful climate forecast, our NASA explorers are pushing the limits of discovery every day. But on a very human level, they're people with families and friends who have a stake in finding out why and how the planet is changing as rapidly as it is.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it. And so when we try to understand the thresholds for life, where life might exist elsewhere in our solar system and the universe, water is one of those things that we look for.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Moving on to coastal water forecast for the south coast, south to southeast winds 25 to 30 knots with seas around 10 feet. On the north coast, some areas of gale warnings for east winds 30 to 35 knots. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage looking at north winds at 15 knots for the day Wednesday. Clarence Strait, winds will be southeast at 20 knots. And for the day on Thursday, we've got lighter winds, especially on the north coast there. Variable to east at 10 knots. For the south coast, north winds 15 knots. Central southern interchannels, northwest winds at 10 knots. And for Lynn Canal, south winds at 15 knots. And for Prince William Sound on Wednesday, small craft advisories, northeast winds 25 knots, seas 4 feet. Cook Inlet, north winds 20 to 30 knots with 6 to 9 foot seas. Kamishak Bay, north winds 30 knots. Gale warnings for the western North Gulf Coast and the Barren Islands for northeast winds at 35 knots with seas around 12 feet. And for Thursday, Cook Inlet, south winds 10 to 15 knots with 3 foot seas. South winds at 20 knots for Kamishak Bay, and the Barren Islands will see southeast winds at 20 knots. North Gulf Coast, southeast winds 15 knots, seas 10 feet, and light east winds at 10 knots for Prince William Sound. For Wednesday, Kodiak Island, gale warnings, northeast winds 30 to 40 knots, strongest in Shelikof Strait, seas 13 feet. Small craft advisories for the Alaska Peninsula, north winds 25 to 30 knots, seas 10 to 12 feet. And for Bristol Bay, north winds 25 knots with 5 foot seas. And for the day Thursday for Bristol Bay, winds become south at 20 knots, seas subsiding to 4 feet. South winds 20 knots for the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula. Pacific side, east winds 15 knots from Cape Saratchev to Sitkinak Island. And for Kodiak Island, east winds 15 to 20 knots. For Unalaska Island tomorrow, gale warnings for north winds up to 35 knots with seas just under 10 feet. And a more variable lighter wind pattern of about 20 knots for Unimak Island. Small craft advisories for the west central and central Aleutians, Kiska Island to Atka, south to southwest winds 25 knots and southwest winds 30 knots from Kiska to Shemya. And on Thursday, eastern Aleutians, south to southwest winds 15 to 20 knots, west winds 15 knots for the central Aleutians, and southwest winds 20 knots for the western Aleutians. Pribilofs tomorrow, variable winds at 20 knots, seas 5 feet. Good gales for St. Matthew Island and the north and northwest Bering Sea, south winds 40 knots. Gale warnings for St. Lawrence Island, winds increasing to 35 knots from the south, with seas building to 10 feet. Small craft advisory for 25 knot winds along the southwest coast. And for the day on Thursday, Pribilof Islands, winds diminishing to 15 knots, seas subsiding to 6 feet. Southwest winds 25 knots for St. Matthew Island with 13-foot seas. And for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, south winds 25 knots. Yukon Delta coast, west at 15. And St. Lawrence Island, Norton Sound, southwest winds diminishing to 30 knots throughout the day with seas running 7 to 13 feet. And for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast on Wednesday, west winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. Western Arctic coast, southwest winds 15 knots, 4-foot seas. From Wales to Cape Beaufort, south winds increasing to 25 knots with seas building to 5 feet. And for Thursday, storm warnings, western Arctic coast, south winds 50 knots, seas 18 feet. Full gales from Wales to Cape Beaufort, southwest winds 40 to 45 knots with seas 14 to 19 feet. Central Arctic coast gale warnings, south winds 35 knots and 20 to 30 knot winds for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast with 4 to 6 foot seas. And for tonight, weak trough brings some light snow and flurries there to the eastern Arctic coast, extending down into the Brooks Range. A little of that getting south of the mountains, just maybe some flurries. Periods of rain become lighter for Kodiak Island, and chance of occasional light rain for the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, begins to push into the Panhandle, especially to the south there. And the next storm over the Russian Far East makes a move into the northwest Bering, the front anyway, increasing winds for St. Lawrence Island. In fact, high wind warning kicks into effect, St. Lawrence Island, Seward Peninsula, northwest coast, western Arctic coast, as well as the Noatak Valley for Wednesday night through Thursday, from winds gusting to 65 miles an hour, along with coastal flood warning, St. Lawrence Island up to the western Arctic coast. Otherwise, that front weakens and brings some moisture inland from the eastern Arctic coast southwestward to the southwest coast. Isolated showers, south central Alaska.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.